In the early 1900s, in the heart of Chattanooga, Tennessee, 9th Street once cut through a half dozen city blocks in a district that was known as the Big Nine. The Big Nine was exclusively African American segregated and was a glory land of entertainment. Theaters, restaurants, hotels, and filling the air was music. Rhythm and blues, jazz, gospel, and soul. And one of the establishments of the Big Nine was a saloon called the White Elephant. And almost every evening, 2 orphan children would be outside that saloon busking for a few pennies. Andrew, a teenager, would play guitar, and his little sister, Bessie, would sing and dance. This is where Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues, and the most popular female singer of the 1930s, got her start, singing on the street to escape starvation. Bessie's childhood has been described as a miserable one, even by herself. Her father was a Baptist preacher from Alabama, and that doesn't make you miserable in and of itself. He died before she ever knew him. By 10 years old, her mother and her oldest brother had died. She and her remaining 5 siblings were left to fend for themselves on the street, and music was her way out. With a golden voice, a thunderous stage presence, an audacious feminism, she took the music scenes of Chattanooga, Memphis, and St. Louis by force. At 29, she got her first record deal with Columbia Records and would become one of the greatest early recording stars. And there is no telling how brightly her star would have shone had she not died young. At the age of 43, she was killed in a car accident on Route 61 between Memphis, Tennessee, and Clarksdale, Mississippi in 1937. Her funeral was held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she had relocated. It was attended by more than 10,000 people. Yet, she was financially ruined. Most of her earnings had been kept by Columbia Records, and the money that she did have, she spent wildly on the road. She was laid to rest in an unmarked grave outside of Philadelphia because the family didn't have enough money to pay for a tombstone. Only in 1970 was her burial site properly commemorated when Janis Joplin personally paid for a gravestone to be placed at Bessie Smith's final resting place. Bessie was prolific. I counted, and the best count I could get this week, 171 singles that she recorded. This is 30 years before Elvis Presley or Buddy Holly's first recordings. And of course, all her songs are about the blues. Of those 171 songs, 75 have blues in the title. Jailhouse Blues, Gulf Coast Blues, Mama's Got the Blues, Frosty Morning Blues, Weepin' Willow Blues, Pickpocket Blues, The Blue Blues, Shipwreck Blues, the Red Mountain Blues, one of my favorites, the Mean Old Bedbug Blues. And of course, Backwater Blues, which the band has played this morning. It's a blues standard, and it's often been associated with the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, the most destructive river flood in the history of the United States. But Bessie wrote the song while in Nashville. The flood she observed and wrote about was the Cumberland River flood. Christmas morning, 1926, the Cumberland River was 60 feet out of its flood stage and almost washed Music City away. You hear it in the lyrics. It's rained 5 days and the skies have turned dark as night. There's thunder and lightning. The winds began to blow. There's thousands of people. Ain't got no place to go. The backwater blues done called me and packed me up to go, 'cause my house fell down and I can't live there no more. Hundreds and hundreds of our neighbors to the east and the north are in that situation right now, in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, which might turn out to be the most expensive and extensive hurricane to strike the United States. Thousands of people ain't got no place to go. And we will help them best we can. Already partnerships are being sought and checks have been written. As of this morning, in total, $20,000 Simple Faith has sent to the Second Harvest of the Big Bend, who are feeding people there. And Operation Airdrop, one of the most innovative ministries that's out there. They are working now in western North Carolina after first coming to Florida and realizing that Florida knows a few things about hurricanes, but the western Carolinas need a lot of help, so they'll be flying supplies in. This storm has been the only thing on so many of our minds, and I know that we are grateful to have averted disaster, but we hurt with and we hurt for those who did not escape the backwater blues. And that's what's been on my mind this week, but more than just this single storm, and I don't mean the next one forecast to be in the Gulf in the coming week. But a bigger question: why? Why do landfalling hurricanes crush some communities while literally next door neighbors go unscathed? Cedar Key, Perry, Keaton Beach. These little towns not 200 miles away from us are flat this morning, while Helene's feeder bands seem to have just reached our eastern flank but spun away as if held off by some invisible hand. I wonder if you would read with me verses from Psalm 69 as a responsive unison reading. Would you stand with me? And let's read these verses, and let's read them as if the storm were making landfall at your front door. Save me, O God, for the floodwaters are up to my neck. Deeper and deeper I sink into the mire. I can't find a foothold. I am in deep water and the floods overwhelm me. I am exhausted from crying for help. My throat is parched. My eyes are swollen with weeping, waiting for my God to help me. Rescue me from the mud. Don't let me sink any deeper. Pull me from these deep waters. Don't let the floods overwhelm me, or the deep waters swallow me, or the pit of death devour me. Answer my prayers, O Lord, for your unfailing love is wonderful. Take care of me, for your mercy is so. The word of God for the people of God. You may be seated. I imagine that this was the prayer, or one like it, on the lips of thousands this week. Still on the lips of folks in the Carolinas. Some of us were answered in the affirmative. We were kept from harm. Others found their prayers unanswered. Why is this? It must be because all those Floridians on the other side of Apalachicola are such filthy and spiteful sinners. And we are not. That's it, isn't it? I read in one of our county's historical records that one of the McKinnons, A.D. McKinnon, if I remember right, a founding family of Walton County in the 1800s, he was a delegate to the Florida legislature and a Sunday school teacher at the Presbyterian Church. And he would ask the boys and girls in his classroom, who are the children of God? And they were coached to answer, the Israelites and the residents of Defuniak Springs, Florida. Surely he was right, and that's why we have all been spared. Jesus was once asked the same question. It's in Luke 13. A tragedy had befallen a group of Galileans, good men. And the religious leaders asserted that these men had died and their families were suffering because they were sinners. They must have received in good measure what they deserved. was the reasoning. As bad things happen to bad people, and good things happen to good people. Jesus would have none of this. He answered with a question of his own. So clever. Do you really think those men who died were the worst sinners in all of Galilee? Do you think they were the worst sinners in Jerusalem? Are you sure about that? Let me frame that question locally. Do you really think that those who now suffer in Cedar Key and Perry are the worst sinners in all of the state of Florida? Do you think that they are the worst sinners in the Big Bend or the Panhandle of Florida? Are there no sinners on Florida's scenic 30A? Are there only saints along the beaches of South Walton and Okaloosa counties? Or do you think Yancey County, North Carolina, which got 30 inches of rain from Helene, resulting in dam failures and whole communities being washed away, does that population contain more and worse sinners than Raleigh or Charlotte or Shelby, North Carolina? Were we spared because we are so good and they are so bad? Well, we know better than that. If calamity only visited the wicked and the deserving, if people got what they deserved, I think we could all give a number of alternative addresses that by any honest estimate would have been a more fitting and justifiable use of a good storm. Not those poor people like in Taylor County, Florida, a county with only 20,000 people in the whole county, one of the only counties in Florida that has a shrinking population, not a growing population, with one of the lowest median incomes in the entire state, and 20% of that county's children and senior adults already live below the poverty line. And now every incorporated town in that county is flat. For much of our religious history, there has been this dilemma, speaking specifically now of Christianity. We call it theodicy. It's a combination of two Greek words, a word for God and the word for justice. Literally, it means justifying God. We believe in an all-good, all-powerful God, and yet evil exists in the world. It is rampant and undeterred. And those who are innocent or undeserving, those who at least are not the worst of sinners, they become the victims of viciousness and injustice. So the question is, why won't this all-good, all-powerful God intervene? If He won't, then God is not all good. If He can't, then God is not all powerful. This is the conundrum that has tortured the minds of philosophers, theologians, and common people for centuries. It's more than an academic exercise. Many people, believers, seekers, atheists, agnostics, all have struggled with this idea of reconciling the two. Childhood cancer, crippling birth defects, genetic aberrations, individual and widespread inequities, tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes that jump over one house only to land squarely on the next and obliterate it, volcanic eruptions, random suffering, inexplicable evil, uncorrected injustice, COVID that gives one person the sniffles and gives somebody else a case that nearly kills them, lost brothers in combat who die because of the distance of just a few centimeters, car accidents, school shootings, orphan children, widowed wives, sexually assaulted teenagers. If these scenarios, very real scenarios, haven't brought forth question marks to your own mind at some point in time in your walk of faith, I wonder how far along that road you've actually walked. And that's not a criticism of any kind. It's simply an admission that when one moves past the early stages and steps of faith, we are sometimes left with deep, deep question marks and not many answers. I don't have any real answers today. I have some thoughts. God is good and God is great, just like we were taught to pray at the dinner table. Evil is very real and suffering is random. But here I take an anti-theodicy approach. That is, I can't reconcile these opposites. And I will not perform theological gymnastics to even try. Because saying things like, well, we'll understand it all better by and by. It's all a part of God's plan. God knows what He is doing. You must have sinned for this to happen to you. God just needed another angel in His heaven. You didn't have enough faith. You know, we all have free will, or 100 other cliches that we might use. All these statements, no matter how well-meaning some of them are, insults the person who is suffering or who has been tormented by some evil. It doesn't take the pain serious. It's better to say, not serious, stop it. My iPad's talking back to me there, sorry about that. It's more honest to say, I think, simply, I trust a good God, but I don't have answers for everything that happens in God's good world. I simply don't. That seems more honest. Honest to reality and, no pun intended, honest to God. Here's an example I received from my friend David Gushy. David is one of today's leading Christian ethicists, and when he was a student, one of his doctoral advisors was Rabbi Irving Yitzhak Greenberg. He prefers to be called Yitz, thank God. 50 years ago, Yitz Greenberg wrote a little essay entitled Cloud of Smoke, Pillar of Fire. And Dr. Gushy has built upon it. After years of reflecting on the Holocaust, his essay was a question, and here it is. How can anyone speak of a loving and caring God ever again without making a mockery of suffering? No statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. Let me explain that. Greenberg's European relatives were deported to Auschwitz. Some survived, some did not. And some of those who survived told him about the suffering they endured there. And one of the most heinous things that would happen is the crematories would sometimes fail. And while waiting to be repaired, the genocide had to continue. Those trapped in this hell would be forced to place on fuel-soaked pallets living children freshly torn from their mother's arms and be burned in the open air. Greenberg never recovered from these stories. How could he? How could anyone? So he said, whatever you say about God, whatever moral or ethical declaration or explanation that you're going to put forward, if it cannot hold up in the presence and the pressure of the worst evil and the worst suffering imaginable, it should not be said because it cannot be true. I hold to Greenberg's ethic and to his conclusion. Because you can't explain evil or suffering away, and from it you should not turn away. Evil by its nature is inexplicable. So much suffering is uncaused and unjustified. We should find true evil and true suffering horrifying. We should find it offensive. We should find it indecent and inhuman, because that is what these things are. They cannot, they should not be acceptable. But all of this cannot be laid at the feet of God, making God responsible for evil and suffering. That would make God a monster. These opposites cannot be resolved. They can only be lived with, held at the same time. The benevolence of God is real. Suffering and evil are real. And sometimes in life, these are each held one in one hand and one in the other, because bringing them together just seems impossible. A lighter example, because I will not leave Rabbi Greenberg's story with the last thing that you hear today. I remember an awful tornado outbreak, Palm Sunday, 1994. 30 tornadoes that morning, mostly in Alabama, in Georgia, and South Carolina. One struck the Goshen United Methodist Church in Piedmont, Alabama, and then cut all the way across North Georgia for 200 miles. Now, of course, the news trucks get out quick, and they find, where I come from, the first shell-shocked, bewildered hillbilly that they can get their camera on. I'm not being derogatory, because these are my people. And every time I see a reporter preparing to interview one of my tribe, I brace myself over what they're going to say, but that it could also be an aunt, a cousin, or someone that I went to school with. And I just hope that they have a shirt on, their teeth are in, and if appropriate, they're wearing a bra. One of my people was interviewed after this hurricane outbreak. Her hair was in rollers. Her mobile home behind her was a pile of splinters. She was wearing a pink muumuu, sans bra. And her dentures had likewise been lost to the storm. And she said this, I'll never forget it. Well, I was just there in the kitchen eating a mayonnaise sandwich. I swear to God, WRCB TV, Channel 3, Chattanooga, Tennessee. I was just standing there in the kitchen eating a mayonnaise sandwich, and it's just like they say. It sounded like a train coming over yonder hill, and we didn't have time to do nothing. And she said, I don't know how I lived except that God was with me. I love that woman. She was grateful. She was honest. And I don't doubt for a second that God was with her. But that does not mean that God was not with the 500 people severely injured that day, the 40 who were killed, including the pastor's 4-year-old daughter at that Goshen United Methodist Church, who clung terrified to a pew while the entire roof collapsed on worshipers who were waving their Palm Sunday branches and singing, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Hurricanes are the result of low-pressure systems that move across warm tropical waters. Earthquakes are caused by the normal release of energy from the movement of tectonic plates. Sickness and disease are as old as the ecosystem that sustains us, and we are frail beings. Evil people with twisted minds and monstrous intentions will always live among us. This is the natural world. It is the natural state of affairs. To ignore it or to explain it away is a travesty that only compounds the suffering. It does not alleviate it. And as utterly shocking as this may sound to some when I say this, in the face of such suffering, don't look to the heavens to find God. Look to your suffering neighbors, for that is where God is. Because God is not in the storm, if I might borrow a line from the prophet Elisha. God is in and with the storm blown, now homeless families in Steinhatchee, Florida. God didn't cause the rising waters. God is in the evacuees who lost everything to the flooding on the French Broad River. God is in that child who cannot escape the abuse of her stepfather. God is in the innocent children dying in today's wars. Don't look for God up there or out there. Look for God down here. Don't look for God in your answer all theology books. Look for God in the question marks and in the confusion. Don't look for God in the explanations of religion. Look for God in suffering people, because Jesus said that's where you'll find Him, in the least of these. The hungry, the cold, the thirsty, the imprisoned, the put down, the overlooked, the marginalized. It's fine to sit and ponder these big philosophical questions. I enjoy it very much. But in times like these, we really don't have time to sit and wonder. We must rise and act. We go out in the name and the power of Christ, and by going in Christ's name, we actually meet Christ on the way in those who are distressed. We have few answers to give them, but we have love, we have help, we have hugs, we have hands, we have hearts, we have ourselves. An act of God is not some disaster, no matter what your insurance policy says. An act of God is a person of faith and a follower of Jesus who attempts to heal the world. That is an act of God. And let us all act in that fashion.